Hi, welcome to the Pleasant Lake History Museum in beautiful downtown Pleasant Lake, Indiana. It's our goal here to store the artifacts and stories of Pleasant Lake, the remarkable story of our little village. Come on in. So the building itself was built in 1949 to be a doctor's office. The doctor in town, Dr. George Nelson Lake, had come here in 1902, and he was a town doctor going around with a little black bag until he died suddenly in 1947. The local folks decided we got to have a doctor. So they went to a doctor, Alfred, who lived in Hamilton, a town nearby. He said, I'll come to Pleasant Lake a couple of days a week and be a doctor, but I've got to have an office. So whoever owned this land carved out a little section and gave it to the Pleasant Lake Lions Club. The Pleasant Lions Club built this building in 1949 at a cost of $6,900, which is about $70,000 in today's money. So this is a copy of the original survey map of this area. The survey was done in 1831. Now why 1831? Well, that's because that was the year they were starting to kick the Potawatomi Indians out of this area, and people from the east who were going to settle here want to know, well, what's out there? So they did a survey, and you can see there's a lot of marshy areas and swampy areas on the map. But if you look very closely right here, there's a little line. And today that would be Bellefontaine Road and Main Street out here. But of course nobody lived here permanently in 1831. That's an Indian trail. The first Indian trail, Bellefontaine Road and Main Street here, were the first east-west road across Steuben County. This little beauty here represents one of the businesses in a thriving Pleasant Lake. This is the Daisy Garden Plow. It was built in 1884. It's a garden plow, as you can see. They sold over 2,000 of these in Pleasant Lake for $3 a piece, which doesn't sound like much, but of course that's 1884 money. It's about $90 in today's money, so they weren't that cheap. So these are the two of the earliest settlers to come into Pleasant Lake, Steuben Township. This is Samuel Carter, and like most people in those days, he was a subsistence farmer, but he also sold fruits and vegetables, which was a little different. It says in 1871 he sold 50 bushels of raspberries, which is kind of interesting because you think about that. To sell 50 bushels of raspberries, you have to pick 50 bushels of raspberries, which would not have been easy. This guy's interesting. This Abner Windsor, he was, as a young man, came out to this area when it first opened up, saw potential. Somehow he had money, because he bought up hundreds of acres all around what is now Pleasant Lake. Went back to New York State where he was from, married his girlfriend. They came from New York State to Pleasant Lake by horseback. It took him a month to get here. He was the first settler in this area to build a frame house as opposed to a log cabin. If you were standing out on the sidewalk facing the museum in the early 1900s, this is what you would have seen. You'd be standing about where the little girl is. That building is still here. We'd be here where the pool room, lunchroom, harness shop, and shoe store are, which shows the business in Pleasant Lake. It's pretty much abandoned now, but every side of the street would have been filled with businesses at one time. This is from the 1880 Steuben County Atlas, and it shows western part of Pleasant Lake, and there's a lot of information in here. This house was built by Jacob Van Orden in the early 1870s. It's still here at the west end of Pleasant Lake, the biggest house around. He came here, promised his wife he was going to build her the best house in Steuben County. He came here because he was a businessman. He owned a dry goods store and various other businesses in Toledo, Ohio. He came here because he saw potential. He saw the way to make money. The reason he saw the way to make money is this. The railroad. The railroad came to Pleasant Lake in 1871, and the railroad made this a real town. People wanted to come here for business and live. So you have Jacob Van Orden. Down here are ice houses that Jacob Van Orden owned. Down here you have the White Rose Mills. It was a sawmill and a flour mill, steam powered, both owned by Jacob Van Orden. It said that the sawmill could cut 8,000 board feet of lumber in a 10-hour day using a 40 horsepower engine. So then, this became the resort town of Steuben County. People didn't go necessarily to Lake James and places like that because they were too hard to get to. But by rail, you could come to Pleasant Lake. There were 4 passenger trains a day from Fort Wayne in the summertime. People would come spend the day or spend the weekend because there were 3 hotels in town. They could go to ball games, concerts, parks. There were several parks around town. You could rent a boat and go out on the lake. These are all rented boats. The guy had a business renting out boats. And there was even a steamboat, the S.K. Hooper right here. This photo gallery, the guy who had that, Byerly was his name. He was the town doctor. He also ran a photo gallery and a library out of his home. That became then a hotel. After that time, it became the Lakeside Hotel, not to be confused with the Lakeview Hotel, which was just down here at the end of the street. Here's information about education in schools in Stueben Township, Pleasant Lake. As more and more settlers came here, they started building one-room schoolhouses. Some were actually buildings, some were in people's homes. And in 1872, the locals said, we got a lot of people here now, we want to have a real school. So they built this one. And you can see it in this picture as well. Where was it located? Well, it's just down the street here where the school is now. So this was 1872. This picture is from the 1880s probably, or early 1900s. There's the school barn all dressed up. All the kids. There's a horse-drawn bus. And there's the school. But on the evening of March the 31st, 1915, the school burned to the ground. And immediately it was replaced by this school, which is still there today. There are not very many schools built in 1915. They're still in use. But this one is, and today it's a Montessori school. Here's a couple things from the school. These guys won the county basketball tournament in 1928, which was a big deal. There were quite a few schools in Steuben County then. So this was a big deal with those guys. These are the Ransburgs, and that's D. Harpham back there. Here's the 1909 Pleasant Lake High School football team. They had a football team for a couple of years. If you take a look at the football, it looks like a pumpkin. And here are the first basketball teams in Pleasant Lake High School. 1909, and they had a girls team, pretty spiffy looking outfits, and the boys team of that same year. The school then, the first graduating class from Pleasant Lake High School was in 1884, and the last graduating class, as we'll see, was in 1958, when the high school closed and consolidated with the Angola schools. So you know the story of Sojourner Truth. She took that name on herself. She was actually from New York, and her given name was Isabella Baumfree. She spoke Dutch, by the way, before she spoke English, because of this family who owned her were Dutch. Anyway, she became a leader in the abolitionist movement before the Civil War, traveling all over the country. She lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she came to Angola at the invitation of abolitionists there, spoke at the courthouse. It was a big deal. There is today a statue of her at the old courthouse in Angola. And believe it or not, she came to Pleasant Lake because she was invited here again by abolitionists. Now, she was a very controversial figure in her day, and there were people who didn't like her being around here. She was arrested in Pleasant Lake, Indiana, not because they wanted to charge her with anything, because they wanted to get her out of town because she was a troublemaker. So you're going to arrest somebody, you got to charge her with a crime. The crime she was charged with was this. They said she was in violation of the state constitution of Indiana of 1851, which said no Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state. You couldn't come into the state if you were black, it was illegal. Now, that was mainly ignored, but they used it as an excuse to get her out of town. And she visited Indiana often. There she is with Abraham Lincoln. These are some random shots around Pleasant Lake over the years. This one shows the Chadwick and Ransburg department store, which was across the street. This part of the building and this part of the building are still there. That was John Matson's hardware store, and it's no longer there. But part of this building is here. Chadwick and Ransburg, and then the Ransburg Brothers department store was the department store in Steuben County. Everybody came there to shop for clothes, shoes, hats. This is a scene at the Matson Hardware. They had a big sale on stoves, 1910. Of course, they would have been wood-burning stoves. The thing about these stoves, they could burn both coal and wood. This is my favorite picture of old Pleasant Lake. So when was this picture taken? Well, maybe 1905, 6, somewhere in there. You can see there are no automobiles in it, no gas-powered anything. Here's the Ransburg building, the part of it that still exists. This was the drugstore. This was a restaurant. It says lodging as well. Across the street, you had the Lakeview Hotel with a nice balcony. Down here, you had the grocery store, the meat market. So both sides of this street would have been filled with stores at that time. When you look at the picture, here's an odd-looking wagon. Undoubtedly, it was coming down from the railroad, the depot down here, to haul what, I don't know. Old pictures like that interest me. These people were all told, I'm sure, to stand still for a second while they took a photograph. The ad is for wallpaper being sold at the Matson hardware store. I had a guy in here from the REMC, the electric company. I said, well, look, they have electricity. He said, no, they didn't. Those are not electric lines, they're telegraph lines. This is a more modern picture. This is from the 1950s, and there's the museum that we're in now. But you can see even then they were buildings on both sides of the street. Across the street was a gas station and mechanics place. You could buy Chevys there. And next door, the building that's still there was originally what you would call a dry goods store, became a grocery store, and an antique store after that. This picture is what is interesting. This wagon, I don't know why he had it out here. You see all these people in the street, all men, by the way. And what were they doing out there? I don't know. Somebody said, hey, come out and get your picture taken. I like this picture for two reasons. One, it shows the barber shop, which we've recently acquired and turned into a 1950s barber shop, part of our museum project. Also, I had a lady in here one day, I showed this picture, she says, oh yes, I know that picture. She said, that's my father. He was the principal at Pleasant Lake School for many years. There was a train wreck in Pleasant Lake on Christmas Eve of 1908, passenger train coming from Angola down here. It crashed just north of town a little ways. Fortunately, no one was killed, but there were injuries, and you can see it was quite a mess. Ice was an enormous business in Pleasant Lake for a while because of the lakes around here. There were 3 ice businesses in Pleasant Lake, 2 on Pleasant Lake and 1 on Long Lake over here. So the ice was cut in blocks. You can see these guys, they got paid $1 a day to cut ice. Obviously it's a seasonal thing. Many of these guys also worked in the summertime at the gravel pit. But you can see they were really good at making the blocks pretty uniform. The blocks would then go up in conveyor belts into these buildings to be stored, covered with sawdust so it didn't all melt. This picture is right behind the museum. We can tell that because the building next door is right there. It still stands, none of the other ones are still here. So the ice was used, of course, by people for refrigeration. It seems kind of silly today, but that's what we did. There was no electricity. So the housewife had put a sign in the window, 20 or 50. She wanted a 20-pound block of ice or a 50-pound block of ice. The iceman in his wagon would come by, deliver a block of ice, and these were zinc-lined ice boxes. The ice would last a week, maybe more. Of course, you had to have some way of catching the water as the thing melted. It seems, again, extremely inefficient, but that's what they did. That's the Van Orden house in the background, the house is still here. These are called ice plows to get the ice cutting started, where we cut into smaller sections. And it was said in 1881, the Pleasant Lake ice houses had 15,000 tons of ice stored away for shipment. And again, it was possible because of the railroad. The railroad could ship that ice to Fort Wayne as far as Detroit, as far south as Louisville, Kentucky. These sticks are kind of interesting. They were sold by the Pleasant Lake Lions Club in 1935 at the Pleasant Lake Centennial. The first settlers came here in 1835, and in a weekend in August of 1935, the town had a big celebration with bands and stories, and the Lions Club sold these. They're not real canes, of course, they're just kind of souvenirs. But the wood is interesting. The wood came from logs that were part of a corduroy road that went east of Pleasant Lake. Corduroy road, they cut down logs, laid them side by side, covered with dirt to make a road. They dug it up, and in 1935, they built an actual log cabin out of those logs, put it on the school grounds just to show people what log cabins used to look like. And they used this wood then to make these canes. The interesting thing about the wood is that corduroy road, this wood, was laid down in 1840. This is the famous dope bucket. Now, anybody who went to high school in Steuben County in the 40s and 50s would have known about the dope bucket. What happened was this: the smaller schools in Steuben County formed their own athletic association. Not Angola, that was the big city, we didn't deal with that. And he got a guy to make up a traveling trophy for their basketball. What would happen would be, they would take the dope bucket, which is obviously an ice bucket, they would put the center court during warm-ups, cheerleaders would usually put candy or cookies in it, and the two teams would vie then to win the dope bucket. The team that won got the dope bucket, and they defended it until such time as they lost it to some other team that was part of the group. The first game was held in 1938, and there's the score, Fremont 52, Scott 12. They carved these in there. So what teams were involved in the dope bucket? Well, two of them still exist, the Fremont Eagles and the Hamilton Marines. Obviously a third one was the Pleasant Lake Spartans. There were also the Scott Center Bulldogs, the Metz Bulldogs, Orland Tigers, and the Salem Center Cardinals. They quit using it in 1957 for the obvious reason that most of those schools started closing down, and we got it here. Here's the dope bucket in 1956, held by the Pleasant Lake Spartans. This is the last graduating class of Pleasant Lake High School, 1958. The first one was in 1884 through 1958. And we have over in our library the names of everyone who ever graduated from Pleasant Lake High School all those years. These are photographs of the graduating classes starting in 1920 up through 1958. And people will say to me, gee, there weren't very many kids around here in 1920 or 1921. The answer to that is, yes, there were a lot of kids around here, but they did not go to high school. Very few kids went to high school in the 1920s, which is why Steuben County had an 8th grade graduation ceremony every year for all the schools in the county. That's where most people stopped. I would venture to guess not 20% of the kids who were high school eligible actually went to high school in those days. There's the largest graduating class from ever from Pleasant Lake High School in 1935. That's Dale Harpham, we'll get to him in a minute. In 1943, we'll point out one of the graduates, that's this guy, Robert Fuller. And this is a memorial for him on this wall. Robert Fuller's parents, Gerald and Evangeline, he owned the gas station across the street where they sold Chevys, and his mother was a teacher at the school here. He had an older brother, Richard, who went to Annapolis, was an officer in the Navy. In 1943, Robert graduated from Pleasant Lake School and immediately joined the Navy. He became a mechanic's mate on a ship, a submarine, the USS Keat. Submarines in those days were named for types of fish. And in 1945, in March, the Keat was operating near Japan, actually closer to Okinawa. They surfaced and radioed back to Pearl Harbor that they were running low on supplies. Pearl Harbor said, okay, give us a weather report from your location and come on back. The submarine was never seen or heard from again. It's never been found. There's a memorial plaque for Robert at the cemetery down here. That's his picture. This is a copy of the Western Union telegram his parents received saying he was missing. What it says in essence is, your son is missing. Don't tell anybody. This is wartime. You're not supposed to give away where ships are missing. And an interesting story, I was in here with people one time telling this story, and a woman from the back came up, she said, yes, my mother was engaged to him. They were going to get married when he came home from the war, which he obviously never did. This is the Pleasant Lake Baptist Church celebrating their 100th anniversary in 1950. One of the first churches around, and they celebrated this in 1950. The church over there was built in the 1880s. So a lot of folks went to the church, came to celebrate that particular time. We have the original founders of the church, their story here too. This is our library with a lot of books and information about Pleasant Lake and Stueben Township. We have all of the yearbooks ever done at Pleasant Lake High School, the first one in 1909. Now, in the 1930s, they didn't print them for some reason, I suppose because of the Depression. We've got them from the first one in 1909 to the last one in 1958. We also have every issue of the Spartonian. Once a month, the typing classes at Pleasant Lake High School typed up a newsletter about the school, odds and ends, upcoming basketball games, gossip about the kids, and it's all there. So anybody who went to school in the 1940s and 50s, there's probably a story about them in there someplace. This is a atlas of Stueben Township, not Steuben County, just Stueben Township with Pleasant Lake in the middle, taken in 1898. There's a thing about it, several things. One is, this is Pigeon Creek, and it went over into Long Lake there, but it doesn't anymore. In 1906, Pigeon Creek was dredged from the very beginning all the way through, and now it goes into Long Lake right there. It was done to dredge land, to drain swamp and marshy land, to have more land for farming. Also, the gravel company over there wanted faster moving water for the gravel washers. But when they dredged along Pigeon Creek, it decreased the size of all the lakes along it. For example, Long Lake here was 169 acres, now it's 91. Golden Lake over here was 235 acres, now it's 119. There was, toward the beginning of Pigeon Creek, Cedar Lake, 600 acres gone. They drained the whole thing. You'd never get away with a thing like that today, but did in those days. People ask me about the size of Pleasant Lake. Well, Pleasant Lake is not in the Pigeon Creek drainage, but it went down anyway. It was 85 acres and now it's 54. Music was a huge part of Pleasant Lake, because it wasn't many small towns, and in Pleasant Lake, one of our most prominent citizens was Dale Harpham, Pleasant Lake High School class of 1935. His older brother Dee had gone into the United States Marine Band. Dee graduated in 1929, and as soon as Dale graduated from high school, they got him into the Marine Band. He was not old enough to be in the Marine Band, but they stuck him in anyway. And he spent his entire career there, becoming eventually the director of the United States Marine Band. And the United States Marine Band, as many people know, is called the President's Own. They play at most White House events, play Hail to the Chief, that kind of stuff. They do concerts and performances as well. Dale didn't just go there and forget about Pleasant Lake. He came back off and directed the high school band here, the high school band in Angola at one time as a guest. Because he was the director of the Marine Band, he got to meet a lot of people. That's him with Jackie Kennedy. That's him with John and Glenn, the astronaut. One of my favorite pictures of Dale Harpham is this photo here. It shows Dale Harpham with John F. Kennedy Jr. They had a birthday party for John Kennedy Jr. at the White House. And Dale noticed that people weren't paying much attention to him. So he got down on the floor with John Jr. to play as a little toy helicopter. The interesting thing about it, and the sad thing about it, is this was taken 2 weeks after John Kennedy Jr.'s father had been murdered. Music was a huge part of Pleasant Lake, as it was for many small towns. They had, like a lot of towns did, the town band. That's the Pleasant Lake Town Band. That's not in Pleasant Lake, by the way. There was a Pleasant Lake Orchestra. The church had its own orchestra. These guys were known as the Elite Quartet, and if you go back to the old newspapers, for 30 years these guys performed all around the area at many events. This is the town band again. This was kind of interesting. This was a story done in 1953 about the town band, but especially this fellow right here. His name was Worthy Tuttle. He played cornet with the Ringling Brothers Circus and with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Lived right across the street. Came back and gave music lessons to all the kids in town. He was Dale Harpham's instructor. This is the band in 4th of July 1918, just down the street here. Interesting how they're dressed. They're all wearing suits, even though it's July, probably hot. The other interesting part about this picture are these buildings. They don't exist anymore. They're just down from the museum. Weaver and Ransburg was the drugstore in town, and it was there for many years. In my day, it was known as Johnson's Drugstore. And next door was the first state bank of Pleasant Lake. Yes, Pleasant Lake had a bank. It was founded in 1914 with $25,000 in assets, and went out of business 20 years later, 1934, as thousands of banks around the country did because of the Great Depression. And in those days, there was no FDIC, there was no insurance. If your money was in the bank, you lost it. Gravel Company was a big business in Pleasant Lake. It was just west of town near Long Lake. About 1906 or something like that, they started digging gravel out of there. They dug a huge pit, and the gravel out of it was mainly used to make railroad beds as the railroad expanded throughout the country. There was an enormous pit. It eventually started filling up with water in 1923. That's when they went out of business. But a couple of interesting things about it. It must have been an extremely noisy operation. Steam shovels, steam locomotives working around the clock down there. Now it was a seasonal thing. They didn't take gravel out of there in the wintertime. Interesting little tidbit too, they hired immigrants to work the pit. They hired Italians. One year they had Hungarians. I don't know where they got them, but they would live in shacks along Long Lake and work at the gravel pit. The pit that filled up with water is still there. It's called Pit Lake, real imagination. It's part now of the Boy Scout camp. You can't go back to it anymore. The clock is from the First State Bank of Pleasant Lake. When the bank closed in 1934, one of the people working there, Ruth Harmon, said, "Can I have the clock?" And they said, "Yeah, take the clock." It worked until a little while ago. We want to get it running again. You can see it's a nice clock. The red arrow indicates the date. So you just moved it by hand if you didn't have 30 days in the month. The clock was made in New York in 1898 and was sold to the bank by the Randsburg department store across the street from the bank. These guys are Civil War veterans. When the Civil War broke out, over 100 men from Pleasant Lake signed up. Steuben County had the largest percentage of men of any county in Indiana sign up for the Civil War. This is a reunion in 1900. These guys are from 74th Indiana. Guys from Pleasant Lake joined different regiments, but this was the 74th. So this is 1900, a reunion, and this, keep in mind, the Civil War ended in 1865, so these guys were getting on in years by that time, but there were two reunions here in town of the 74th Indiana. These guys were all prominent people in Pleasant Lake in the Civil War. Middleton Perfect was a lake name for him in the southeast corner of the township. He was badly injured in the war. Simeon Aldrich rose to the highest rank of anybody who came from Pleasant Lake and became a colonel in the Civil War. He eventually, like Middleton Perfect, died of injuries suffered in the war. He died after the war. But this guy is just interesting. His name is Elisha Teagarden. He was the custodian at the school. But in the yearbook, the 1909 yearbook, it doesn't even mention that. It talks about his service coming under fire in the Civil War. This is my favorite person ever from Pleasant Lake. This is Lurene Tuttle. Lurene Tuttle was born west of Pleasant Lake and no longer exists in 1907. Lurene has 2 stars of what's called the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which you've probably heard of. One is for radio and one is for television. Her father was a railroad agent. That's to say, he sold tickets at railroad stations and things like that. Her grandfather was Frank Tuttle. He was an amateur theatrical guy. He ran what was called the Croxon Opera House in Angola. Her father was Claire Tuttle, Pleasant Lake High School class of 1900. As I said, he was a railroad agent who was very interested in amateur theatricals. In his day, mainly blackface minstrel shows. They moved around a lot because of his job, and eventually, after a series of misadventures, wound up in Monrovia, California, which is a town near Pasadena, north of Los Angeles. They ran a grocery store. But he still did theater. He got her on the stage when she was a very little girl, and she took quite a liking to it. Took acting lessons, became very prominent in theater on the West Coast for many years. Then radio came along, and she became huge in radio starting in 1930 with Dick Powell. Some of you may know that name if you're old enough. She became what was known as the first lady of radio, the most heard woman in America. She was on the radio as many as 15 times a week in different shows, as a regular on some shows, as a guest on other shows. She was a regular on the Ed Sullivan radio show, and several others, one called The Great Gildersleeve, which was a comedy. Because it was radio, and because she was very good with her voice, she could play 2 or 3 different characters on the same show at the same time. She played on regularly an adult woman and a teenage girl. One of my favorite stories about her, she was in a drama called Sisters, and she played one sister who was good and one sister was evil. Well, this is radio. You have to distinguish between the two. How do you do that? Well, she would change her voice. And to make it easier to do that, she had 2 different microphones and helped her to change characters as she went from microphone to microphone. But she did that for years. In 1934, she was in the first movie she was ever in. It was called Stand Up and Cheer, and it's the movie that made Shirley Temple a star. Orson Welles took an interesting career. In 1948, she was in 2 films. One of them was in Orson Welles' version of Macbeth. Then television came along. And she was in everything because she was a well-regarded character actress, which is why you probably don't know her name. She was never the star of the show. She was the character actress. So she was right away in the 1950s, early 50s, in a series called Life with Father. Then in everything. You name a series from the 50s, 60s, 70s, she was probably in it someplace. She was on the Isle of Lucy show. In the 50s, Westerns were huge. Gunsmoke, Continental Travel, Wagon Train, on and on. She was in all of them. She was in Gunsmoke twice as 2 different characters. Some of you might have seen her in the Andy Griffith show. She was on there twice as 2 different characters. One of them, she was the famous little lady shoplifter. She was in movies at the same time, quite a number of them. The most famous movie she was ever in, that one of the people would remember today, was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960, where she appears as the sheriff's wife. She's in 2 movies with Marilyn Monroe. This is a publicity still from one of the films. I think they were probably having fun with that. So this is a representative sample of some of the movies and TV shows she was in. She was in The Beverly Hillbillies, I Dream of Jeannie, The Munsters, the first episode ever of The Munsters, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Later on, she was in Murder, She Wrote. Some people, for some reason, know the Don Knotts movie, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. She was in that. She was in all that stuff. Now, she didn't move away from Pleasant Lake and never think about Pleasant Lake again. She was back here often because her family was here. She had a lot of relatives here. And in 1945, her father moved back from California to Pleasant Lake, spent the rest of his life here, joined the Pleasant Lake Lions Club. So, she married a guy named Melville Ruick, who was an actor and announcer. He was an announcer on radio shows. They married. They had a daughter. So she married Melville Ruick. They had a daughter, and that's Barber Ruick. As you can tell from the glamour shot kind of look, she also was an actress, singer, dancer especially. She was in the movie version of the Broadway show Carousel, and in some movies in smaller parts. Now it gets more interesting. She was married 3 times. Her 3rd husband was John Williams, the composer. Star Wars, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jaws, Superman, all the Harry Potter films. That's Lurene Tuttle's son-in-law. John Williams, he's 94 years old today. He's been nominated for 54 Academy Awards. The only person with individual with more Academy Award nominations than that is Walt Disney. So they were married. They had 3 kids. Now we're talking about her grandchildren. Her grandson, Joseph Williams, is the lead singer for a rock group called Toto. You may know her song Africa or Rosanna. They're still popular for that. That's her grandson. She had a grandson named Mark, who's not pictured here. He was a drummer with Air Supply and groups like that. They had a daughter named Jennifer, who's not an actress or in music at all, but she is a psychologist. But her daughter is. Now we're talking about Lurene's great-granddaughter, Barbara Gruska. Barbara named for her grandmother, Barbara Ruick. She is a backup singer with a group called the Foo Fighters. There's much more information about Lurene you can find online, and I'd be happy to tell you about too. So that's the brief history of a remarkable little village of Pleasant Lake. We've got quite a history for a small place like this. And we have the depot down here that's being remodeled. It's been put back into use. It was built in 1882 and is on the National Register of Historic Places.